Okay, let's bring all our speakers back for our joint Q&A. Turn your videos on and we can go into, all right. Okay, so yeah, speakers, if you all have any questions, please feel free to chime in. But I've got a bunch here queued up here. I can start with Mark. Let's go back to Mark, our first presentation. You talked about eustress and how that's like the sweet spot of stress. Having too little stress, you'll be ambivalent, you'll be apathetic. Too much stress, you'll flip out. How do you know when you're in that sweet spot zone? And like, what are you looking for? What are you trying to measure? Because I think the distress zone is pretty obvious. I mean, you're freaking out, you're stressed, you know, you're nervous, you're anxious. But what would you say to guide people into finding that right zone?
On your own, it can be difficult. In a community, it's much easier, for sure. I think, you know, over time you recognize on your own, you know, when you are beyond, you're past that distress point. I mean, distress is easier to recognize, right? When your heart has stopped pounding, or when your body is given up, when you don't know what to do in a project, like distress is easily recognized. So is like you said, the ambivalent state. Eustress is this tension here, and I think, you know, maybe all of us have this in all of our fields and all of these talks, you know, today, like as we're going through all of these considerations, there's all uncertainty that we carry around that. And I think, you know, we all have this. This is where, like in our Christian faith, like it's faith. Like there's something around faith. There's an uncertainty, you know, with that, and that's good, that allows us to question, you know. And so I think this is where the biblical, you know, stance for community, you know, is helpful. And that's why I say it's going to rely on a community where you can, you know, ask each other, where are we on this? Okay, am I at that point? Have I crossed that line? And, you know, your friends can say, no, you're fine.
A follow-up question to something that we talked about earlier too, Mark. We were talking about pre-COVID. So when COVID hit, the church took their services, threw it on Zoom, and that was okay. It was average, right? What would you have recommended churches look or try to? That's a tough question. What would, like, now this is about to come and then no one can come in person. What would you have recommended for A, do you have a solution for them? B, if not, what kind of framework or thinking should you suggest to them so that they can keep doing what they're doing? And this is a question for Mark and for others as well.
No, this is not a question for me. This is literally a question for everybody. And I think this was a question I saw coming in the comments in the live stream as well, just about we're defining the church as all of us. And this is what Douglas was saying in his talk. I think there is a responsibility that it became apparent in COVID, that the church is your community. And if you see your church falling apart, there's now an onus on you to jump in and like do something. You know, for those churches who have an older congregation, if you're a part of that church, like there's now an onus on you to jump in and help. That doesn't mean you're going to go develop a new mobile app for that church. That might mean you're going to like call them up on the telephone and like help them like dial into a service or something. It's being more cognizant of what's going on, and every situation is different. I'd be more curious to hear from Douglas or some of the others on this topic, because it is really understanding where you're at. If there is a church who says, look, what we did just doesn't work and we're willing to scrap, you know, what I framed as Horizon 1, like we can just do away with all that and let's just start experimenting. This is what we do at Faith Tech. It's like, let's just do nothing but experiment. And at Faith Tech, we're okay with that. We're just going to experiment and do fully Horizon 3, you know, things. We're okay with throwing away the experiments, versus somebody who still their business model is built on donations. They're gonna have to do carve outs. We're going to figure out like, okay, we still need, you know, the donations. We're gonna have to do other things as well. But yeah, I'd love to hear from, you know, Douglas, who talked about this specifically, or others as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot, and hindsight is always 2020, and it's easier to say. My predisposition, obviously from my talk, is, at least from what I saw in the church that I attended stuff, I was a little I don't know the right word, disheartened that so much effort was continued to make the live production online. Like a ton of effort was, you know, online live production, high quality video, high quality content. There wasn't a lot of like careful thought on, well, what does Zoom fatigue do to people? Do people really need another content stream? Do we really need another weekly video thing to watch? And it was sort of like, yeah, in small groups, we'll just meet on Zoom. Soon enough, nobody was. I know many friends where the Zoom group was just dead, because when you have meetings all day and then this is your community, like that's not the same. And so I think what would have been nice to see is thoughtful things on pastors empowering small group leaders to really be pastors and go out and say, hey, can we meet in a park? Can we do something? Can we socially distance and walk and something like that? Can we try tools like GatherTown? Is that like a better way to gather online than Zoom? Is there other ways instead of this relentless effort to just a high quality online stage production?
Totally with you. Like all we did was, I mean, that's the simplest model. It's a lift and shift model. Let's take whatever we're doing and throw it online instead of redesigning and re-looking at like we have this awesome platform. There's so many tools and features that we can't use in the physical world. How could we better use those things to have richer, deeper conversations or build communities? And that thinking was missing. Any others have thoughts here?
Well, one more, sorry, I don't want to dominate, but it just sparked another conversation. And even if it's like, okay, if we are stuck on an online thing, well, can we share the platform? So something that actually I did for Easter, because it was during COVID, was just with about 15 of my friends, we just gathered on Discord and we all shared our testimonies. And so everyone got to share like 5 to 7 minutes. And I had a friend who was Mormon who I didn't talk to in years come on. I had friends from all across the Christian spectrum, and everyone was able to like hear each other's story and just really hearing like powerful just impact of that raw sharing. And that's another thing. It's like I would have loved to see like pastors share the stage, to be really frank, and let other people share how God's working in their lives and how much more life-giving that can be for the body. Than just a really well articulated talk, but just people being able to share their story. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, news feed of testimonies. I love it. It's great. Any other people have thoughts on this topic? If not, we can roll to the next one. Switching gears a bit. I wanted to touch on Margaret. You were there was an earlier talk by Al Arisman talking about how God's economy is very different than the world's economy. That's really what you're saying, and it's what's full circle back here. So when you think about metrics for social impact, what are you looking at? Obviously, money's not the only thing, and some of these things are kind of hard to measure. So how would you guide people if they're looking to measure what's a good socially impacting organization?
I mean, it's going to vary depending on the cause, and also as far as I think actually a lot of nonprofits are actually pretty good at developing metrics, right? So even thinking about Cal State Fullerton, right? They can, if one of their metrics is reducing the achievement gap, right, between people of color and white students, right? And so they can measure that, right, by graduation rates and or time to completion to graduation. And so I think it's gonna differ by industry, by what the goal is. But I think also kind of going along with Dave R's talk, as far as I think we also need to think about innovation, right? Make sure that we're not using metrics that are just easy to measure, but that we're using metrics that are actually accomplishing, like really measuring the goal, right? And so yeah, that is something definitely that because as that is like, as far as what reports and what information we're collecting, that does have to kind of be handled at the upper level, right? As far as but there can still be a groundswell, right? As far as, especially for nonprofits, as a donor, right? You can ask those questions, right? And nonprofits, they need, you know, your donors are your customers, right? And so if that's the kind of information that donors need to feel comfortable donating to your cause, right? So reach out and request it. Like, what is, you know, what is the impact that you're looking to see, and then ask them how they measure that, right? So you know, time to graduate, you know, even like with that metric of time to graduation, right? If the students are just loading up, taking 6 classes a semester to get to graduate on time, but then they're getting C's in their classes, right? It might not, in the end, why do we want to reduce the achievement gap? We don't want it just in terms of college. We want to reduce the like wealth disparity between people of color and white Americans, right? So, you know, we're pushing students to just graduate in 4 years, but then they have crappy GPAs and it makes them harder to employ. So maybe the bigger question, maybe the metric we need to be collecting instead is, you know, employment. Like, what are their starting salaries when they graduate?
Margaret, can I just say amen to metrics when you're trying to do innovation? Mark, you started us with this, and you talked about how in Horizon 1, the metrics are very conventional and clear. Nonprofits are just as sophisticated, by the way. I hate to break burst anybody's bubble, but nonprofits are just as sophisticated for the most part as many commercial enterprises. But we get stuck in the same conventional mindsets in that this is the metric that needs to go up. The sustainer program that I described for the prison ministry, the first set of problems we've had to deal with both internally and with the organization and with donors is, how do you measure that? Because the initial upfront metrics to acquire somebody to do an ongoing, just like a subscriber, are actually more expensive. But the long-term value, that's that 32x return I talked about, that's what really matters. Well, that wasn't just like magic and we just figured that out. Like, to Mark's point, that was a Horizon 3 sort of thing. And it was like, what are the metrics that we need to understand to know if this works? Same things, you know, Margaret, in your case with education, and everybody else in your own fields. Measuring innovation requires thinking anew just as much about the measurement as it does the new outside ideas.
I would take actually a contrarian view here and say that a lot of the metrics for companies to become more responsible and good stakeholders have already emerged. So for example, if you look at the ESG frameworks for Chinese companies now, looking at whether or not there's women in board representation is becoming very popular. If you look at even within the United States companies, greenhouse gas emissions, very standard. But if we zoom in another level down, it's also within the communities that they're operating in, do they have a presence? JP Morgan is doing a lot in this regard. If you look at another metric, it's a way of the integrity of the organization as measured by a number of scandals or regulatory infringements that the company has done. I think a great example of this would be like the Enron and the fraud scandal. Anyone who knows books would have identified that with a reasonable understanding of the energy markets at the time. This framework is really just taking the different pieces of a large company, breaking it down to what are the segments that have impact outside of the internal organization, and then developing fundamental metrics that steer the direction of good governance. I think a lot of these things can be just broken down to what is a responsible thing to do, but you need the framework of what are the different categories.
Mark, were you going to chime in, I think? No. Oh, I thought you were going to go in. No, great point there. And I mean, at the end of the day, there's no shortcut. So this is a nuanced topic. You can't just pick and choose these. And I think Margaret alluded to this. The easiest thing it's easy to measure revenue. So we do it, and we want to take these shortcuts. And revenue does mean something, but it's not the end all and be all. So I think it's really a cultural shift. Like, as we start looking at these things, do we really care? And if we do, then we'll do the hard work to figure out what's a good thing to measure. But yeah, that takes time and energy. Cool. Yeah, I got another question here for Alex. Okay. You talked about how people can impact their industry, and just kind of like the example that you shared about how you changed Facebook's model of training models using a different set of people. So what would you tell somebody that, I don't know, that didn't know what to do? There's a lot of the how that really debilitates people, and they say, oh, I don't know what to do here, so therefore I'm just going to give my money to an organization that does good things. So what's the guidance that you would give somebody like that, that's, you know, that's in a company, maybe it's not Facebook, maybe they have some Java skills, or maybe they're a lawyer, or maybe they're doing something, but they don't really know how they can bring about impact to their industry?
I would consider identifying who are the experts in the field and having frank conversations with them. I didn't immediately jump to this conclusion either. I had looked at precedents that were set by other fields, and then I had also looked for edge cases within what's called data annotation. This whole data labeling market, there's tech unicorns, and so a lot of money being made and value being generated here. I looked at what the edge was, and I brought that closer to mainstream within a large company like Facebook. Talk to experts. That's probably my simplest advice, just because there's going to be such a long tail of different scenarios and suggestions. And to try and go like much further than that, I don't think I'm an expert outside of my domain of machine learning, a little bit of finance, and investing.
Okay, so expert in the industry, not per se an expert in bringing about social impact, but it's really the expert in that specific field of work. Is that fair?
That's the first lens, but to also find if there are experts that are also thinking from a social impact perspective, those people are going to be on the edge once again, because chances are that is in its infancy if we're going to go compared to the S curves that were shown earlier. But I'm willing to bet if there isn't already an expert who actually is trying to consider social impact within most of the fields where a listener's chiming in from, there will be in due time. But I think the core piece of this is like really doing the diligence and thinking about what they're saying, but also reconciling that with what you know about the fundamentals of your respective industry. I could only get away with all the things that I was able to do because my metrics were stable or improved on what the company cared about. If I couldn't do that, all of the other pieces would have been moot. But if you can blend those two things together holistically, really finding what are some best practices from a social impact perspective, and then can still maintain or improve that traditional economically driven metrics, you have a winner.
Yeah, that's good. Good.
So when we run a design sprint, just to Alex's point, when you're trying to do something like this, when we run a design sprint, you generally on the front end of this, you bring in experts from a lot of fields with deep knowledge. So like to Dave's point, I love the way he framed it, you know, like this reminds me of type thing. And so like Alex saying, you want these deep institutional knowledge. And so if you can bring a lot of them together that have a different point of view on a variety of topics, that's going to bring a really good variety of ideas that you can experiment on, like what are the new ways to look at these problems. And that's where you can kind of get into these innovation cycles to find those, the meaningful metrics and the meaningful ways to measure these new problems.
Yeah, that's really good. Hey, Dave Che, are you there? I think your video's off, but I wanted you to chime in here because you use a lot of sports to really do, I mean, I wouldn't call it ministry, but really it's building relationships and bringing impact. It's kind of like the same thing. Like you look at a sport, it's kind of like you're playing ball. How can you do anything else but really play ball? But you have a different mindset about that. So I wanted you to share a little bit about how you approach sports. And let's say there's another guy that plays football or whatever. What should they be thinking in their mind as they're playing to try to kind of model what you're doing?
Yeah, you know, I think it's also a lot of like what life stage you're in. I think if you're kind of in the early side of your life stage and you want to get Christianity all right, you almost like, it's like the first time parent, right? You get everything, want to be perfect and everything's kind of mechanized and you want the manual and it's not as natural, right? And then by the time you get to your third, fourth child, you're more like, you know, you kind of can read between the lines, you have great more life awareness. So I think it's more of that. I mean, you know, bocce ball to me is something I just love to play. But while I'm playing, I'm kind of listening to what's going on. If I sense that someone's kind of hurting or someone's not doing well or someone's excited, like I respond to that, right? So I think it is this kind of life on life experience, very much the way that Jesus did, right? I mean, when he was hanging out with the 12, there were moments where like why can't you see that, yeah, I govern the winds, you know? And they were like, what are you talking about? Like, you can even do that. And there were these kind of teachable moments, so to speak, right? So I think it depends on the season of life that you're in. If you're kind of more on the younger season of life in your faith, you tend to want to perfect everything early on, and it becomes like a performance thing. But then as you get older, especially with parenting, right? You probably parented your youngest child very differently than your oldest because you've changed, right? You've matured, and you're kind of, so you're not so hard on yourself, and you're not so hard on your kids. At some point, it's like, wait, you know what? It's really God brings the result. I'm going to trust in Him. So I guess it's an exercise and journey in, where do you put your ultimate trust? And I think that's what happens. And then towards the latter years, I think you start to just enjoy the process and realize it's not up to you. Like, it's not, God, God's going to do this with or without you. But, when you end up doing it, it's such a joy, and it's an expression of love and obedience to the Lord when you do it. So I would say it depends on the season of life that you're in, and whether or not you're a learner, right? When you make mistakes and you get overly religious and you want results to happen right away, like, are you willing to learn from that and get feedback and say, hey, maybe you came out a little too strong. Like, is it about you, or is it about them? Is it about God? I mean, I find that some folks are not that coachable. They're very knowledgeable, but they're not coachable. As a result, they don't enjoy going out and doing, life change things just because, they're not as teachable as someone else who would be less skilled, but they're willing to learn.
Yeah, that's good. So it's like letting go and just having faith that, like, you're not the one that's gonna do anything. You're just kind of hanging out and being present. That's a good, like, burden releasing word. Love it.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Especially for those who are very active.
All right, we're a bit over time. Any last thoughts from anyone before we close? Going once.
Just gratitude. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody.
Of course. You guys are awesome. Thank you for your talks. In 15 minutes, we have Gather Town, network, social, and poster session. Please come and check it out after you take a quick break. And that's the end.
Is that a separate link, Nick? The networking time? It is, right?
The link is bit.ly/PT Gather. We'll put it in the Facebook feed.
Oh, okay.
Sharing it right now. So thank you, everyone. Day one's over. See you guys later today, and then day two tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Take care, man.